front row seat.
What's up, Joshua?
Hey everyone. Welcome to Impact Training. So glad that you're here. So we have things that are happening today. So for just about a minute or so, we have a few friends from Tyler who are going to tell you about the summer opportunity. And right after that, we're going to have a special guest speaker, Dr. Loftin from Southwestern Seminary, who is a philosophy and humanities professor, who will teach us on the resurrection after affliction. And so he's going to guide us through a lot of helpful tips and facts and advice that will help us in spiritual conversations as we're engaging with our friends, and just help us as well understand why understanding that the resurrection really happened is so important to our faith. And then right after that, at 1 o'clock, we'll go out 2 by 2 and do evangelism on campus. So if you've never gone out with us before, I really hope that you're able to stay. Right afterwards at 1 o'clock, we'll circle up, we'll pair up 2 by 2, and we'll just engage in spiritual conversations. And if you've never gone out with us before, don't worry if you're like nervous, you're like, I don't know if I'm ready for that. We'll pair you up with someone who's gone out before. And in your first conversation, you don't even have to say anything, you just watch the whole time. And 1 o'clock doesn't work out for you, because I know a lot of y'all have class at 1 o'clock. We do offer different times to do evangelism throughout the week. And so get with someone on staff, or just ask another leader here at the VSM and tell them, I want to go and share my faith on campus. Would you go out with me? Sometimes not on a date, but go out. So yeah, but we really want to help you grow in sharing your faith. And so Fridays at 1 is a great time to do that, but I understand that some of y'all want class. And so we really encourage you to get with someone on staff, or even get with another leader here. And so I'm going to welcome Ian to the stage.
Hello, guys. Hello. Well, thank you for having Matt and I here. That's Matt in the back. He's my supervisor, director of Rose City Summer Camps, which is what I'm up here to talk to you about. Rose City Summer Camps falls under the umbrella of the Mentor Alliance, and what we do is mobilize godly people into the lives of kids and families to provide tangible help and eternal hope. We do that through camp. And so what we do is we go to different universities across the state of Texas and invite people also that are not from the state of Texas to come in, right, godly people, to walk life with kids in our communities. Minority kids, meaning that we serve kids who usually are not able to afford some of the higher end camps. And so what we do is provide high quality staff to mobilize into those kids' lives, and so that they can get the same experience that kids are getting in the summer elsewhere. And so that's what we're here doing, hoping that some of you guys may be interested. If you don't have a summer job, maybe you want to give your summer over to kids and families for the glory of God and the good of the city. And so if you're interested in that, Matthew has cards that he will hand to you at this time. I'm sorry, I'm trying to fly through this. I got a minute to talk. But the website is on there. You can check out videos that we have on there, some fun field videos that will garner more interest. And so check that out, please. And if you have any questions, our contact is on there as well. We'd be more than happy to answer those for you. Again, we mobilize godly people, and so in order for us to do that, we have to find godly individuals. That's why we're here, and we're hoping that'll be you. Okay? Thank you.
I learned about Rose City. I've gotten to know these guys the last year. It's a good place to work. They for a camp ministry, they pay pretty good compared to some of you guys have worked other camps. And even though it is just a day camp, they will help you find free housing in Tyler. So if you would like to serve in ministry, but you also need to in the summer with a little money in your pocket, it's a good place to. It's a good opportunity for you. Great. You guys, welcome, Dr. Loftin.
Always great to be back with you guys for the Impact Training. I think I get to come about once a year, which is a special treat. Today we'll talk about the resurrection of Jesus. I just called the talk, The Resurrection of Christ, is it fact or fiction? In virtue of being here, I'm assuming that you guys all think that the resurrection of Jesus is a fact. But most of the time, a lot of Christians have a difficult time conveying to skeptics why they can have confidence that this is a factual historical event. So there's a really long and a really short version of this talk. I'm going to shoot for somewhere in the middle because I think 1 o'clock's pretty firm cutoff time for you guys to take off. I'm going to try to leave a little bit of room at the end for questions, but I'm going to do that thing where the professor talks a little bit fast. But in exchange for you putting up with that, I brought you the notes already, so you don't need to do like the mad scribble like a maniac thing that my students have to do sometimes. But I want to start off by asking one of you guys to read a short passage from the New Testament, if you would. It's 1 Corinthians chapter 15. I'd like for someone to read verses 3, the beginning of 3 through the end of verse 8. Someone read that nice and loud for us. I didn't bring my Bible, so it has to be one of you guys. This is 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 8. Just go for it.
For what I received, I pass on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, and then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, he appeared to me also, as the one abnormally born.
So, most of that was not written by Paul. It's in Paul's letter to the Corinthian church, but most of that, as you can hear by the "it was passed on to me as of first importance" opening, he was given that by the early church. And given the time that 1 Corinthians was written, this was the earliest Christian hymn. So it's a nice codified, concise hymn or short creed that conveys, sort of in a nutshell, the Christian gospel. So the resurrection is just absolutely central to the Christian gospel. How important is it that the resurrection is realized to be a literal, historical event, every bit as historical as your walking to this building today actually happened? We'll just skip down a little bit further in the same passage to 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 14, and Paul tells you how important it is. He says, if Christ has not been raised, then what? He says your faith is futile or useless or it's vain or you guys are here just totally spinning your wheels if the resurrection is not a literal historical event. When you go out and share here in about 45 minutes with skeptics, if the resurrection didn't happen, you're just doing nothing but a weird social thing. But if the resurrection actually, literally occurred, just as literally as you're walking to this building today, then it changes your encounters completely. So I want to give not the whole story, but some tips on how to explain or defend the historicity of the resurrection. So my favorite TV show is way older even than me. I think it's so old, it's almost as old as Gary. So, I mean, you can ask him about that, but it's the original Law and Order. I hope that came across in the recording. The old Law and Order, you guys ever seen the old Law and Order reruns? Come on, they're like quality stuff. It's like reason to get up early on Saturday. So it's a cop show, it's a detective show. And so I also always love it that 30 minutes is this crazy thing happens, and then the last 30 minutes is the cops figure out what happened and they prosecute the offenders. Anyway, I guess what I'm trying to say is stop what you're doing and start watching Law and Order. So we're going to get, just like a detective, there's 3 clues for the situation, the crime, or the event. Each clue has to be fully explained. You know, it's no good taking someone to trial, taking Ben to trial, say, if your theory of the crime can only account for 2 of the clues. Obviously, his defense attorney will point to the 3rd clue and say, well, look, this doesn't fit your theory. Similarly, when we think about how to approach as historians a historical event, we have to be able to come up with a theory that explains each of the clues. I'm going to give you 3 clues today, and I'm going to hopefully convince you that there can be no other explanation than that God raised Jesus from the dead. So let's run through these. They're on your handout. You got it in front of you. The first clue, or the first fact that needs to be explained is that the tomb of Jesus was found empty. So here is what every New Testament historian, whether they're a Christian or not Christian alike, all of them, nearly all of them agree, that the tomb was found empty. So what's the fact? Jesus died on a Roman cross, was buried in a sealed and guarded tomb, and yet on the subsequent Sunday morning, the tomb was found empty. Now, we're not saying yet why the tomb was found empty. Christians, of course, think it's found empty because the resurrection happened. But it's not fair as historians to assume that at the outset. So that is a fact that needs to be explained. Why is the tomb empty? Well, let's just look really quickly here at a few sources for this fact. We're not going to take the time to look all these up because we're in a bit of a hurry. But we find that the empty tomb is recorded in a bunch of places in the New Testament. Now, if you're a cop and someone comes to you and tells you some crazy story, and they seem a little unusual, are you just going to believe their story simply because they told it to you? No, that would make you super gullible. You shouldn't just believe stories that sound fantastic anytime. But if later in the day, another person, and then yet another person, these people don't know each other, but they each come to you and tell you the same story, how does that affect the way that you think about whether the story is true? What do you think? Gives it more credibility. Why? Why is it more credible, more believable, just because multiple independent people say the same thing? How does that work?
Body of believers, not just one crazy man.
Yeah, that's right. It highly increases the likelihood of the truthfulness of the story because these people are corroborating each other's testimony. Now, if you find out later that they're all part of the same club and it could be a conspiracy, that's different. But if they genuinely don't know each other, they're from different places, they're just all giving you the same testimony, then they are independent, corroborating witnesses. That's what we have in the Bible. So here's a quick note, though, about the Bible. The Bible is not a book. You gotta keep that in mind. Just because you have something that you call the Bible, and it's all contained in one, this is very handy. Just because it's all handily published in one cover, don't be confused about how it happened historically. This is 66 different books, right? Written by different people, different times, from very different backgrounds in different countries, with different languages. It's just very fortunate that we live in a time where it is all available and can be conveniently published for us in one cover. So it's just a real great convenience for us. But don't assume that it's just one book. That's relevant here because the fact that the fact that the tomb is found empty is reported in multiple independent places in the Bible doesn't mean it's only one person's testimony. That actually is multiple independent corroborating testimony. Okay. Probably you guys are already on board with the Bible says it, so you believe it. And I think that's great. But you got to keep in mind that a skeptic's going to say, well, that's just one source. You have to be aware that the Bible is not one source. It's actually 66 different sources just published together. The second reason we feel confident that the tomb was found empty is because of the story in the Gospel of John for example. You guys remember in John's Gospel, chapter 20, opening verses, what happens? Somebody shows up at the tomb and it's empty. Who showed up at the tomb and found it empty? Mary Magdalene. And probably some of her buddies were with her. If today, my wife, Julie, went and found something highly unexpected had occurred, and she came and told me and the professors in my hallway, who just happened to be a couple of dudes, we wouldn't even think twice about the fact that she's a her. Like, that wouldn't affect the credibility of the story at all. She's a truth-telling person. This isn't my view, but I want to clue you in that in the ancient Palestinian world, women didn't really have a lot of social status. Maybe news to you. The Torah says, the Torah is a collection of Jewish rabbinic teachings that was sort of used alongside the Old Testament as like a teaching tool. It says Sooner let the words of the law, the law like the law and the prophets, the law and the Old Testament, sooner let the words of the law be burnt than delivered to women. So I just kind of give you a quick insight into how the testimony of women was. Elsewhere in the Talmud, you can read, I'm going to paraphrase, it's like the Message version of the Talmud. Let not the testimony of women be admitted into a legal proceeding, a court of law, on account of the likelihood that they will be lying for personal gain. Simply because they're women. So how does this work? If you're like in the market and you steal something and you look around and the only people who saw you were like all these girls over here, you don't even need to run from the cops when they show up. Their testimony is not going to get counted for it. So I'm giving you an insight on how the word of women was viewed at the time. Now, why is that relevant? The Bible says that this critical fact that the tomb was found empty was discovered by people who have no social status at all. Why is that relevant? What do you think? It's relevant because if it were false, the writer of the gospel, say, who theoretically would be making up this story he knows is a lie, he would never have women be the ones who discover the critical fact. He'd have like one of the heroes, Peter, James, one of the real stars would be the ones who show up, at least a dude. That way it would be historically credible. So the fact that the story specifically says this crucial fact was discovered by women indicates what about the story? Yeah, it indicates that it's truthful. Historians call this a quote-unquote embarrassing fact. If you were writing a story and something would hurt your public standing, you would probably either change the fact, that is, tell a lie, or you would suppress that detail to save face. But if you actually wrote your story and you included the embarrassing detail, then when I read your story, I'm going to assume, wow, this person has great integrity because they're including even the embarrassing facts. Does that make sense? So there's these embarrassing facts in the gospel accounts that indicates a truthfulness from the perspective of a historian. And a third quick support for this, that the tomb was found empty, is that in Matthew 28, 11 through 15, a passage that you don't really hear many sermons on, unfortunately, we find this early Jewish polemic, and it says, in a nutshell, this is the story about the guards going to town and tell the Jewish leaders, hey, I know we have one job, keep Jesus buried, but yeah, he's gone now. So we're here to give you guys a heads up. Again, this is the Message version of it. We're here to give you a heads up about that fact. What are we going to do? And the Jewish leader says, here's what we're going to do. We're going to give you some money because this is a payoff. You tell everyone that what happened. Remember? Tell everybody the disciples stole the body. Now, there's a lot of reasons that cover-up story is not a very smart one. But let's just take a moment and observe. What is it a story? What is it a cover-up story to cover up? What's being covered up? Or let me say it better. This is a cover-up because what has to be explained? Yeah, the body ain't there. I mean, like when you bury somebody, you pretty well expect them to stay put. So what dead people do, they stay there. So when it turns out that Jesus doesn't play ball and just stay put, they have to have a story because the tomb was found empty. So here's 3 reasons, including from the lips of opponents of Jesus, that all can agree the tomb was found empty. Whatever theory we come up with has to be able to explain that fact. All right, tracking so far? This is like watching the episode of Law & Order kind of in fast forward mode. All right, the second thing that needs to be explained are these crazy post-mortem appearances of Jesus. All right, post-mortem, that's a fancy term for what? After death. It's like, when people die, you don't expect them to like show up places. They tend to behave and stay put where they're supposed to be. But on separate, multiple occasions, Jesus was seen alive by different people after his death and burial. On what basis do we say that? This is like the next thing. We're at the bottom of the page now. They're kind of indented. First of all, there's the fact that the Apostle Paul recorded, and we just read this in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-7, he records that Jesus made several post-mortem appearances, and he lists off who the people he appeared to. Who did he appear to? Cephas, that's Peter, the 12 disciples, remember that was in the upper room, and there was the whole doubting Thomas scene. A group of over 500 people saw them all at one time, that's pretty crazy. To James, then again to all the apostles, and then finally to the Apostle Paul himself. And remember, that's the road to Damascus from 3 different times in the book of Acts. But wait a minute. Are you saying that we should believe Jesus appeared alive to people after he was dead just because the Bible says so? If you're a skeptic, put yourself in a skeptic stance. What would you be thinking here?
What's your book say?
Yeah. You say, of course your book, your like holy book says that. I mean, this is all a lie, so you kind of expect like the Christian handbook to perpetuate the lie. Well, a couple of quick things about that. First of all, how do we know it's telling a lie? Well, if you're a skeptic, you may assume that it's not telling the truth because of why? This is a crazy story about a guy who was dead showing up to people's parties after he was dead. I mean, of course they think it's a lie. They're not believers yet. It sounds absurd to a skeptic. But you got to remember, from a historical perspective, treating the Bible differently from how we treat literally any other ancient book that you read in college, Homer's Odyssey, the Didache, like Song of Roland, any ancient book, has to be approached on the same grounds. And that's, we're not asking for special treatment for the Bible. But when we apply the exact same historical criteria to the Bible, we apply to other ancient texts, we take it at its word until we have an overwhelming reason to assume it's lying. To assume the story is a lie is not to behave as a historian, it's to make a philosophical assumption because it's a miracle it can't be true. Now today we're not doing a talk on the possibility of miracles, but I think that we easily could do that. I think there's a lot of good reasons. I think that any reason there is to believe that God exists is a reason, therefore, to believe that miracles are possible. Because if God exists, then he can perform a miracle if he good and well pleases. But of course, if atheism is true, then miracles aren't possible, and the Bible must be telling a lie. So this is connected to a broader apologetic. That's why we're focusing on the historical element. But I want to make you aware that any evidence you can generate for God's existence is, ipso facto, evidence for the possibility of a miracle like the resurrection. Second fact at the very bottom of the sort of outline there is that the Gospels report multiple appearances of Jesus to his followers, and that provides independent corroboration. The whole list that we just referred to in the first step is from 1 Corinthians. But now in other places, i.e. in the 4 Gospels, these are corroborated. They're not all the exact same appearances. How about that crazy story where Jesus sort of appears in disguise on the road with the 2 guys after the fact, and remember the 2 guys are kind of bummed out. And Jesus is like, hey, what's going on, guys? Why the downtrodden faces? And then what did they say? They say, where the heck have you been, man? It's like the buzz around town. Jesus, the one everyone thought was the Messiah, is dead. Jesus said, oh, brother, tell me more. And then what did they say? I mean, it's like really the fast forward version. What did they say? Like, oh man, he's doing all this crazy stuff. He said all this great stuff, and we totally thought it was the real deal. And then Jesus sort of reveals his identity, his true identity to them. So that's not referred to in 1 Corinthians. We only get that in that particular instance from the Gospel of Luke. And so I got the references for you there. But remember, these are multiple corroborating independent witnesses. And so what Paul says in Corinthians is supported by what Luke says in the Gospel of Luke, or what John says in the Gospel of John, Matthew, and Mark as well. Does that make sense? All right. Finally, and this is one in my experience, this one resonates a little more, what's the word? It resonates a little more true, believable to a skeptic. Because the last support for the second fact is 2 of the specific people Jesus appeared to. What's so interesting about the fact that Jesus appeared after his death to Saul of Tarsus, as he was then called, and as well to James? What do you think? Who are those people? James's brother, like the half-brother of Jesus. And who is this Saul of Tarsus guy? Like a well-known missionary, right?
He's literally a well-known Christian murderer. He is a serial killer, literally, and he targets a specific group, Christians. This guy is famous. You got to wrap your head around this. The Apostle Paul had a whole career as a serial killer before meeting the risen Lord. Now, if when you mention 1 Corinthians, and if when you mention the corroboration from the Gospels, the person's like, hey man, look, of course it says that you would expect Jesus' people to lie for him. What do we have in a situation with Paul and James then? If the apostle, let me say that. If Saul of Tarsus encounters the risen Jesus, what is he likely to think is happening? You would expect what? Is it possible for a serial killer to have like a hallucination? Of course. It's like possible for any of us to have a hallucination, right? Maybe like a weird brain aneurysm related event or something crazy like that. But if Saul is going to have an experience that's not the risen Lord, do you think he's going to be guilty of thinking, that was the risen Jesus? No way. He doesn't believe Jesus is divine. He fully believes Jesus is an imposter, a charlatan, and he got what he deserved. And he's dead, and he's going to stay dead. So if Paul's going to have an experience that he has trouble interpreting, possible interpretations for him are not going to include, wow, the risen second person of the Trinity, the Messiah, long awaited for. No way. He's going to assume something else. What about James? I mean, James is Jesus' brother, for crying out loud. Can you not count on anybody? What does the text in the gospel say about Jesus' family? Yeah. And you see the reference there, Mark 3:21, and again, it's first 10 verses of John chapter 7. I encourage you to read those later. But I'll summarize for you. Jesus' family, and maybe it's not all of them, the text isn't specifically clear about that, but what is clear is that members of his family, including his brother, were highly skeptical about what he's saying. Does anyone here have siblings? I mean, I've got 2 younger siblings. They're way older than you guys, but they're still young in my mind. I've got a younger sister who's 34 and a younger brother who's 31. Act like he's 12. Anyways, the thing. When we were young, sometimes they would come and tell me things like, hey, I'm a cowboy or something. And you play along, right? But in the back of your mind, you're thinking, this guy, again. You're not a cowboy. You're like a dumb kid. You're my brother. Hey, knock it off. I suspect it's kind of like that with Jesus' older brothers. They probably thought, oh boy, there's Jesus out around town again, doing this whole Messiah bit, just tricking people left and right. They were skeptical of his claims initially. But the fact is that they went from being incredibly skeptical, something happened, and then they became super believers, followers of Jesus, willing even to follow him at great peril to their lives. What must have happened to change their mind? Well, I suggest that they saw actually the risen Lord. The text says they saw what they believed to be the risen Lord, for sure. And I think the evidence supports that they actually did see him. Otherwise, why the drastic change? Finally, the disciples' belief in the resurrection. You know what? Doing good on time. I am going to pause and mention that little excursus real quick. Wasn't sure if I was going to have time. Okay, you see that note? These accounts are reliable history. At this point, skeptics regularly will say, pump the brakes there, fella. Let's just hold on a second. I think the stuff that you're pointing out from the Bible, it's got to be not legitimate history. It's got to be fake news. It's got to be that a story got circulated, and then it kind of grew up into a legend. You guys know about legends? Does anyone here play video games? Anyone really good at this and play video games like Legendary Mode? Yeah, that sense of the word legendary has nothing to do with what I'm talking about. I just like that. In a historical sense, a legend is a story that has gotten to the point where so much fiction has grown up around the original story that the original kernel of truth is lost. Now brace yourselves for this, because I'm probably about to give you a reason to not sleep well tonight. It's clear to you that I'm pretty nerdy. I'm to a point where I can accept that fact, I wear it pretty well now. I'm a nerd. But there are people out there who are super nerds. I mean, they make people like me look like regular, boring people. They're super nerds. I don't know what you call them. And one of them is a terrific historian who has done some amazing sociology of history and found that when it comes to historical accounts, it takes at minimum the span of 2 generations, so 2 lifetimes of people, for enough legend to even possibly grow up around a story for the kernel of truth in the story to be obscured or lost. And let me just prove it to you real quick. You guys are all adults. I'll take it on faith. No, Greg was pointing out, Gary was pointing out some young faces here. Can you remember stuff from when you were a kid, say like 12 years ago? What's your earliest memory that you remember pretty vividly? Remember like a fifth birthday party or something? I remember my 9th birthday party. My mom made a train cake, and it was awesome. And we played water balloon war afterwards. I grew up in the sticks. You know, it's a big deal out there. So how are you? I'm trying to remember your name. I forgot now. Kyle.
Yeah.
How old are you?
24.
Seriously, how old are you? 20?
24. Yeah.
No, really. You say so. Do you remember anything from before you were 8 years old, something like that?
Oh man. Yeah, I think I remember I can remember one thing of preschool, and it's really fuzzy.
Wow. All right. So how old were you when you became a believer?
I was 17.
Okay. That was. I'm not great at math. Is that 7 years ago? 7 years ago. Can you remember who was there, where you were at, stuff?
Yeah, I can remember that.
You guys think your parents can remember their wedding day, even though that was way before you were born even? Do you think they can remember details like who was there? It's a slur. Like who they were standing across the altar from, like their spouse. my wedding was my first date with my wife was as of last night, 15 years ago, by pure happenstance. I swear I'm not this guy. Our first date was Valentine's Day 2004. I remember it pretty vividly. It was 15 years ago. I remember who was there, Julie. I remember the restaurant and stuff. I mean, I remember how to get to that restaurant. Do I remember every single face from that restaurant that night? No way. I'm not Sheldon Cooper. I didn't remember. But I remember the key details, right? Even if I misremember what we had for dinner, I can still remember the kernel of truth. And I bet your parents can for their first date too, even though it was how long ago was your first date? 35, 40,
50 something.
40 years. 50 years.
24 and a half years ago.
Do you remember who was there? Yes. You can remember the kernel of truth. But now, if the span of 2 lifetimes, say if you live to be 110, you may start losing, or false memories may by then have had time to creep up. The reason historians say it takes at least 2 generations is because there's this amazing natural control mechanism that keeps too much legend from growing up too fast. And it's other people. Here's my silly illustration. I grew up in the sticks, right? My grandparents had this tiny little stream. You guys would call it like a ditch if it were on the side of the road here. And I would catch these tiny little perch. I mean, fit in your hand. It would be as if I went back to school in kindergarten and told my friends, hey, caught a perch. Yeah, great. But then fast forward to junior high, and I'm telling my buddies on the junior high basketball team, and then I realize a perch, it's kind of lame. It's upgraded, it's like a catfish, 3 or 4 pounds. And then in the high school, I'm in a different school now, and suddenly the story's 14-pound largemouth bass out of the lake, kind of struggle. And then fast forward to when I'm old, 50, and I'm telling my grandkids about the time I hooked an 800-pound tuna off the Florida Keys. Right? That's an example of how legend accrues. It's too fast forwarded because that's the span of 1 lifetime. But I'll never get away with that. Why? Because the other people who were there, like my brother and sister, they're going to, of course, tell everybody what actually happened. They're going to go around and say, look, that tuna story, that's ridiculous. He doesn't like tuna. He never's been to the Philippines. He's a liar. You know what's going to happen to my story? It's just going to die with me. It'll never go anywhere. That's how we can have great confidence that these are not legendary accounts. Okay, third, the disciples believed in the resurrection. Right away, you're going to think as a skeptic, brother, of course the disciples believed in the resurrection. Do you know what disciples means? Yeah, I mean, I've got buddies, and you know, these days my buddies are all Christians, but there was a time when I could tell any absurd story I wanted to, and my buddies would be like, yep, wow, I was there, it totally happened. And you know, I know you guys are all Christians, you don't know what I'm talking about, but you have friends who have those kind of friends. But here's the thing. After Easter Sunday, the disciples came to boldly preach the resurrection. You kind of expect that, right? But you've got to know the passion narrative, because what happened? What's the story arc? The disciples are with Jesus, they're with Jesus, they think he's the Messiah, which is a really big deal. Something happens, they totally throw up their hands and they think, wow, that guy took us for a bunch of suckers for 3 years. We're going back to our day job, we're going home, we're going back to being fishermen. Fast forward just a couple months, and bang, they're back off the boats, they're out there preaching the gospel, and almost all of them were gruesomely murdered for it. How do you explain that kind of a story arc? Like, what's the psychological trigger? What changed their perception? It can only be one thing, surely. That they believed the resurrection had actually happened. So look, these are the 3 facts that have to be believed. That have to be accounted for. The disciples came to believe in the resurrection. You might think, well, they realize that everyone thinks they're like social outcasts, because who gets tricked by some carpenter's kid and thinking he's God? And you might say, well, now they're just going around saying they believe in the resurrection to save face. They don't want their memory to be like as a bunch of gullible suckers. They want people to believe they're lying. Okay, is that possible? Sure, it's possible. People lie for stuff all the time. Not you guys, you bunch of Baptist people. Like other people lie about stuff all the time. It's terrible. Would you lie if you stood to gain something from it? I mean, not you, sorry. Would other, like sinners, would they die if they stood to gain from it? Right, totally. This is like people do this on their taxes all the time. Would you lie if you stood to gain from it, even though you know it's false? Yeah, of course, it's like the same thing, right? Okay, if someone puts a gun to your head and says, listen, you tell me the truth or I'm going to kill you. Things change, right? Maybe you're willing to die for something you actually believe in. Like cops and firefighters and soldiers do it all the time, right? They believe in things they believe. They die for things they believe in. But do you die willingly for something you know is a hoax? No way, of course not. You probably push the hoax and push it and push it and push it right up until someone threatens to kill you over the hoax. Then it's like, okay, joke's over. I'm done. I'm going home. You guys can know the truth. You know what I mean? The disciples were willing to die for what they believed in. And we know people don't die for what they know to be false, and so that indicates a truthfulness on the part of the disciples' belief. Does that make sense? So, as Christians, of course, we think the best theory to explain these clues, these facts, is what the Bible teaches, that God raised Jesus from the dead. I'm going to give you real fast some of the most powerful or most influential historical alternative theories. I'm going to make them sound ridiculous because I think they are. But I want to tell you up front, these are, no joke, dominant alternative accounts from history. Right? The first one is right out of Matthew 28:11 through 15. And it is, the tomb was found empty, the whole deal, because the disciples stole the body. Let's talk about it. We've got 3 facts that need to be explained, and we've got a plausible explanation. How does it do on fact 1? The disciples stole the body. Does that explain why the tomb was found empty? Yeah, totally. Okay, tomb is empty. There's no body in it. There's no body because the disciples took it. So far, so good. Second fact. What is the second fact? What is it?
How Jesus appeared.
Jesus' post-mortem appearances. Here's going to get a little weird. Disciples claim that Jesus appeared alive to them. Does that work with that they stole the body? Why not?
Jesus didn't appear just to them.
How did Jesus appear to people? Alive. If the disciples stole the body, is Jesus alive? No, he's like down in Peter's basement in the freezer. Right? He's just a dead body. If you put the corpse in your freezer, you know it's not possible for the person to be appearing alive to other people. This theory can't explain the second fact. What about the third fact? The disciples came and believed and preached the resurrection. If the disciples stole the body, and the disciples tell everyone Jesus is resurrected, and the disciples are killed for it, why isn't that really coherent given that the body's down in Peter's basement? Oh, yeah, totally. They won't die for something they know to be false. Like if you're Peter and you know you've got Jesus' corpse in your basement freezer, and you're going around, sure you go around and tell people Jesus is alive because it makes you famous. But then a mob is going to kill you, and you at this point realize this was a bad idea. Gang, I've just been promoting a hoax. Everyone come back to my house, check the basement freezer, it's over. Right? So the first theory doesn't really prove very successful. How about this? If the disciples had stolen the body, maybe the Jewish leaders, maybe the Jews stole the body, right? The Jews didn't really like Jesus. And you catch that in the Gospels or not, it's pretty clear. All right, so let's work it. The Jews stole the body. Will that explain fact number one? Yeah, sure. And the tomb's going to be empty. How about the second fact? Will it work there? Not as neatly. Why not? Well, if the Jews stole the body, let's run the story. Mary goes to the tomb. She's like, oh my goodness, Jesus isn't here. She runs back. She tells Peter and John and the whole gang. They come down. Oh my goodness, the body's not. It's a resurrection. Kind of works, right? For about an afternoon, because you guys be the Jewish leadership, I'll be the disciples. Run to the tomb. Oh my goodness, the tomb is empty. I'm going to go around town and start telling everyone what Jesus said was going to happen. It's totally happened. It's a resurrection. Everyone should believe and become a Christian. Is that what you guys want to see happen? No way. You're the Jewish leadership. What do you want to see happen? Oh yeah, you want the whole Jesus is God thing to get squashed and just go away. What can you do to make that happen? Yeah, it's like, hey, everyone come down to the local meeting place here. We got Jesus' body. It's in our freezer. Stop telling everyone it's a resurrection. And it's over, right? That didn't happen. So that must mean that the Jewish leadership didn't have the body because they could have squashed the whole Jesus movement right off the bat. How about this? This is a little more creative. This was famous in the 19th century. Jesus didn't actually die on the cross. He only kind of swooned. So this was kind of plausible at first glance, right? I mean, we know what Jesus went through physically before the actual crucifixion. He got beat up pretty bad. He was in pretty terrible shape. He would bled an awful lot. And then getting crucified, he would be in terrible shape. But let's just assume, for the sake of argument here, just for a minute, that maybe he didn't quite die. He sort of held on by a sliver. What are some things that we would have to believe in order to believe that? Let's run through a quick catalog. There is a team of guys whose whole job is to kill people hanging on crosses. Remember, he stabbed in the side, the whole thing. It's like one guy's job is to make sure people are dead. You don't even have to go to college to be able to do that. I mean, but still, maybe he's having an off day. A person remained alive, kind of snuck through. What happens to the body? Buried in a tomb. When you guys were kids, you guys are going to think my childhood was pretty weird. This is all true. When you were kids, did you and your siblings ever wrap one, when the laundry got done, wrap one bed sheet around a person so they can't move? Punch them and kick them. It's more like tickle, tickling. We didn't punch and kick them. Did you guys ever do that when you were younger? Do that to somebody? One sheet. They can't move their arms, right? Now, I don't get into a whole lecture on burial practices in the ancient world, but They didn't just lay a sheet over people when they buried them back then. You know why? It's like dead people really stink. And they didn't have morgues and sealed stuff back then. So, conservatively, we can be highly confident that at least 15 pounds of wrappings, along with spices and stuff to prevent odor, would have been the shroud of Jesus was buried in. We would have to assume that in his terrible condition, he wriggled free of that. So now that's very hard. My little brother and sister could never wriggle free from like one sheet. But let's just say Jesus got out of like 15 pounds of that stuff somehow, even though he's in terrible physical condition. Then what do we have to believe happened? Right, he got up and walked to the tomb of the... Oh wait, no. He can't walk because his feet have literally had a giant nail driven through them. Maybe he crawled to... No, he can't crawl, remember? So we have to believe that Jesus made his way to the tomb entrance. Now, we're from Texas. When we picture a tomb, we're picturing like a table with a round opening on it. Like, that's not the terrain actually where Jesus was buried. These are typically on cliff sides, and so picture this, a disc shape, not a soccer ball shape, but like a disc shaped rock would be rolled kind of down a V-shaped channel that was sort of dug in. So we roll it downhill, put it where it belongs, and just sort of leave it there. So Jesus gets to the tombstone. What does he have to do? He's got to stand up and grab that thing. Wait, no, again. He's not going to be standing up and grabbing anything to wrestle it open. He'll have to somehow get the thing, roll it uphill a little bit, and then what? He's got to sneak past two guys whose whole job is to make sure no one comes in or out of the tomb. Maybe they're totally incompetent, and he sneaks past them. He's ninja Jesus. he steals downtown, gets to the upper room, which the gospel tells us was locked because of the disciples' fear of the authorities, right? On this theory, Jesus is not divine, so he can't just like magically go through doors. So he somehow picks the lock in a room where people are terrified someone's going to pick the lock and come in without them noticing. Shuts the door real quick, and here to me is this is the ringer. This is where it totally jumps the shark. What does he convince the people in the upper room about? Remember, he invites Thomas, check him out. He convinces them that he is the risen Lord, Savior, the God of life, powerful over death, resurrected. If you're one of the disciples in that experience, you're not going to think that. You're going to think, this guy needs 911 like ASAP. You're not going to believe he's risen, victorious, powerful over death. So I think at every step, this theory is utterly absurd. All right, just about wrap it up here. How about this? The women just went to the wrong tomb. I mean, like, I told my friend that came with me here, Ben, that I'm not great with directions, so we put the GPS, I've been here like 5 times, put it in GPS. I'm terrible with directions, so this isn't like a sexist thing. But you know, this is a real thing in life. People go to the wrong place sometimes, right? It's possible. Do any of you have a loved one whose grave that you have visited from time to time or gone with your parents to visit? Yeah. Do your parents get lost on the way to that grave? Why not?
They know where it is.
Yeah, they know where it is. I mean, maybe if it's like someone they went to high school with 30 years ago, maybe you don't remember what those are. But if it's someone that you have not just been close buddies with, not just been in a loving relationship with, but who you've worshipped as the Messiah, dies, you don't forget where the grave is, right? But let's just say that Mary Magdalene had a terrible, shockingly terrible memory, because she went to the wrong tomb. What does the Bible say happened right after that in the narrative? There's a little conversation. She goes where? She goes back and tells the guys. Remember John raced ahead. James came. He raced ahead means she didn't lead him back to the tomb. We would have to also believe that the beloved disciple himself forgot where Jesus was buried. It was a really emotional time. Let's just say all of Jesus' followers had a worst memory of their life day simultaneously. What happens then? They get all excited. Tomb is empty. This is fantastic. They start spreading the gospel. Who's going to swoop in and do something about it? The government, the Jewish leaders are going to swoop in, and what are they going to say? Hey, knuckleheads, you went to the wrong tomb. It's like one row over. He's right here. It didn't happen, which means that's not a very persuadable theory. There's a bunch of other theories. But just like recognizing funny money, you don't have to study every fake dollar bill that's ever made. You just have to study the heck out of the real thing, bona fide currency. It's that way with competing theory, naturalistic attempts to explain away the resurrection. You just need to know the narrative, the facts, really crisp, really well. And there's a pile of excellent books that lay it out in a really accessible way. Then, no matter what alternative account to the resurrection you are given, you'll be ready to work it through logically and help a person see, like, no, this isn't just some crazy, fantastic, false narrative that we believe because we're gullible Christians. There's really solid historical evidence, no special pleading required, for believing that this is a historical event. Okay, I think I managed to leave about 12 seconds for questions. No, 5 minutes. Any questions from you guys here? Maybe you've heard some other alternative account you want to ask about? Let's hear. Yeah.
Okay, so if I'm a skeptic.
All right, you're a skeptic.
You've given me all this stuff about how the Bible proves that it's true.
A lot of it's from the Bible, not all.
Right.
Yeah.
So I'm sitting here and I'm like, okay, yeah, I can see like the women are portrayed as a
Yeah.
American back, so
Right.
it kind of gives it credibility. But is there like fact that is outside of the Bible source
Yep,
for like
there are.
disciples dying?
There's a lot. Let me say 2 things about that. The first is, I think it's worth gently pushing back and saying, why is there a working assumption here that evidence is suspicious if it's from the Bible, but not if it's from outside the Bible? Because that is a bias that needs to be brought to the surface. You don't want to beat somebody over the face about it, but the Bible is it's a collection of ancient documents, just like all the other ancient documents. If they want that, then they have to admit that they're already committing the informal logical fallacy that we usually call poisoning the well, right? So this is an illicit assumption or bias against an ancient source because it says something you don't want it to say. And I think that's a good point. So that's, from a historical perspective, really relevant. But yes, there are other documents. There's not a pile of documents outside the Bible that say things like, hey, Jesus was totally the Son of God, he was God, he's the Messiah. But there are documents that, I'm thinking, for example, like a 2nd century Jewish historian named Josephus, who in his book The Antiquities corroborates a lot of the details. And there are others as well. The first group of church fathers have word of mouth testimony from eyewitnesses, so they all grew up learning from, like John the Apostle, and so that's firsthand testimony that's been passed on. You read a lot of that too. That information is not hard to come by if you want. You just punch it into Google. Did Michael Kona come here one time? He's got a bunch of stuff on his website. Any of that? Did he bring his resurrection book? It's like, and this is the thickness of it. You know, it's like this tall and this thick. That's an excellent book. And so it's all kind of cataloged there too. Yeah. Yes, good question. Yes.
One argument I've heard before is like, if all of this is true, then most people in the world would believe in it.
Yeah. Why? Don't you wish we could have that much confidence in knowers, like in rational people? You know there's a thing called the Flat Earth Society, right? Like, this is not a joke. There's actually a Flat Earth Society. You think if there is any one proposition, the body of known knowledge, that would be beyond or just be unassailable, I mean, it's like, there's satellites for crying out loud. But not everyone believes that. So the assumption there, I think, is worth questioning again. Is it really that, can we be that confident that everyone would just know? I think no. But I think theologically we have resources for a good answer too, as I wrap up here. God's goal for humanity isn't just for everyone to know about him. So propositionally, he doesn't want everyone to just come to know about him the way you come to know about stuff you learn in class. He wants you to know about him, but the goal isn't just like propositional knowledge, it's relational, right? So the same reason that a terrible way to get to know your wife is just like go to the store and buy a biography about her and learn all about her is a terrible way to have a successful marriage. In the same way, God realizes a terrible way to achieve his purposes is for him to overwhelm us with knowledge. There is more than ample knowledge for people who are open to it, to see it. But I think that it's a wise move on God's part to so arrange the universe and so wire humans that it's easy for us to come to know him as soon as we're willing to submit our wills to it. So, yeah, I think that's maybe a good segue from that. All right, guys, can I just pray for you real quick before you take off? It's great to be with you again. Lord, thanks so much for these college students. Thanks for their faith and the willingness to give up some time on a pretty afternoon to come and talk about the resurrection. We're above all grateful to you for the resurrection, the forgiveness of sins, and the gift of the salvation we have in the Lord Jesus. As these great guys and gals go out to share with others, I pray that you give them boldness and wisdom. I pray that you just line up divine appointments with them and non-believers, that your power will be evident in their lives and that your grace and love and kindness will just shine in their expressions. And we pray for this in the name of Jesus. Amen. All right, see ya.
Thank you.